Quote, as more computing departments begin to deploy embedded ethics modules, we face important questions about scale and costs. What is the ideal number of embedded ethics modules, and how should they be spaced across an undergraduate program? How do we assess the effectiveness of these modules? Is more better? End quote. That's from page 657 of Is More Better When Embedding Ethics in CS Courses, which was written by Diane Horton, David Liu, Sheila A. McIlraith, and Nina Wang. Apologies if I mispronounced any names. We're going to unpack this paper in relation to computer science education, particularly in the K-8 or K-12 space. Here's the abstract for this paper. Quote, embedding ethics modules in computer science CS courses is an approach to post-secondary ethics education that has been gaining traction. In contrast to dedicated courses on ethics in CS, embedding ethics modules into CS courses supports tight connections between ethical considerations and CS concepts, as well as enabling repeated exposure to ethics across multiple courses. Initial studies of the effectiveness of such modules suggest that this approach can increase both student interest in ethics and technology and student self-efficacy towards incorporating ethical considerations in their computing work. Departments wishing to deploy embedded ethics EE modules need to decide how to invest resources, including class time, to maximize effectiveness while maintaining curriculum objectives. Such considerations include the number of EE module experiences a student has throughout their degree program, as well as the spacing of those experiences. Research to date has focused on the effect of a single embedded ethics module. In this paper, we report on a study examining the impact of experiencing EE modules in multiple courses. Among our findings, our results suggest that more is not necessarily better, that a modest number of periodic exposures to EE modules over the course of a degree program may be sufficient to achieve sustained positive attitudes and self-efficacy among students. While pictures beginning to emerge, these results highlight the need for further research on the effectiveness of embedded ethics programs as a whole. End quote. If I were to summarize the study into a single sentence, I'd say that this study investigates the impact of 1 and 2 embedded ethics modules within undergraduate computer science courses. Now, today's podcast kind of builds off of what I've been talking about in the previous 2 episodes, at least if you skip the April Fool's episode that released on Saturday. So these are episodes 180, which is integrating ethics into computer science education, multi, inter, and transdisciplinary approaches, and episode 179, which is This Applies to the Real World, student perspectives on integrating ethics into a computer science assignment. If you don't know who I am, my name is Jared O'Leary, and I have a background working with every single grade kindergarten through doctoral student in a variety of contexts like music education and computer science education. So I'm going to draw from my varied experiences to kind of unpack this paper in relation to computer science education in K-12 or K-8 space. So in the introduction to the paper, the authors talk about how there's an increasing need for including ethics within computer science education degrees, and I would argue within the K-12 space as well. So as I mentioned in the previous episodes, there are many ways that you can go about embedding or integrating or just working on ethics. You could do this as a standalone class that is disconnected from the degree itself, a standalone class that is specific to the degree. You could do it embedded throughout a particular course or embedded throughout the entire degree program, etc. This same idea can apply to the K-12 space, and I've kind of unpacked that more in some of the prior episodes, so I won't rehash that here. Much like previous authors who mentioned this, in Our Embedded Ethics program, section 3 of the paper on 653, the authors talk about how they are focusing on how to think and not what to think. So they're focusing on making discussions safe and having conversations around ethics-informed design choices. And they elaborate on that a little bit more on page 653. Also on that page, they include their research questions. Quote, RQ1. What is the impact of participating in multiple EE modules sequentially across semesters? RQ2. What is the impact of participating in multiple EE modules concurrently within the same semester? RQ3. What is the impact of participating in EE modules robust over different contexts, including different courses, module topics, course levels, and delivery modes? RQ4. Does the positive impact seen in CS2 in the 2022 University of Toronto study replicate? End quote. So the study that they're referring to is they did like a pre and post, just kind of trying to see, okay, in 2022, what happens if you introduce an ethics module within a class, and how does that impact like self-efficacy and whatnot? And so they found an increase, and so they're trying to kind of explore that a little bit more and see, okay, well, we introduce one module, what happens if we introduce 2 modules? Or if we do this over multiple different semesters? Or what happened between when they engaged in that model previously and then they're going into it like a year later or a semester later? Was there any kind of like learning loss or anything in terms of changes in attitude? So the methods section on page 653 and 654, the authors talk about how this was conducted at University of Toronto, which is a large R1, a Research 1 institution, which means they have a high research output, and that the study took place over fall of 2021 and winter of 2022 semesters. If you want to see a breakdown of like the number of participants and gender identities, etc., you can check that out on page 654, which is just a little friendly FYI as a non-binary individual. The other category can come across as a literal form of othering. All right, so let's talk about the results. So this starts on page 654. And so they've broken this down by the different research questions. So 5.1 is titled, quote, positive impact decreases and is restored by a subsequent module, end quote. So they basically did a little pre-post, and on the post test from the first time that they were doing a module to like a following semester, there was a decrease in the overall scores. However, the decrease was still higher than the pre-test on the very first time. So even though there was like between the initial treatment, which is like the introduction of the ethics module, to the next semester when they are actually going to go back and like do another pre-test to see, okay, has there been any change since they've last done this? So over a period of time, have they decreased? And yes, they did decrease in terms of like their attitudes and whatnot, but it was still higher than it was on that initial pretest. Now, the next thing that they tested was a post-test after a second round of treatment. And what they did find is that there was a higher increase from the second round. So they basically described this almost as like a booster shot in terms of making it so that the initial treatment helped to introduce ethics and kind of like helped increase self-efficacy and attitudes and whatnot. It decreased over time because they weren't engaging with this, but then when they engaged in the ethics module again a little bit later, then it increased it even higher than it was previously. So then one might ask, okay, well, what happens if you do even more instead of just one a semester? So the second section, which is on page 655, which is titled A Second Module in the Same Semester Provides Little Added Benefit. They indicate on page 656, quote, we found no significant difference between students who received one module and those who received two, or even between students who received 0 modules and those who received 2. A little bit further down. In other words, receiving either 1 or 2 modules appears to confer benefit to self-efficacy, but 2 modules did not confer significantly more benefit than just 1, end quote. As I mentioned in recent episodes on ethics, it's important to figure out at what point is there a saturation point. When is there diminishing returns for focusing on ethics within computing classes? And while this appears to kind of give some suggestion that, well, maybe you only need to do it once a semester, I would argue that we can't necessarily make any generalizable conclusions from this. Maybe the second module wasn't very enjoyable. Maybe it didn't connect to students in a particular way that the first one did. Or maybe something happened in like society that made ethics less valued or less important than it was previously. Or maybe something happened in the school, like some kind of a traumatic event, and that traumatic event somehow related to ethics. All of this could kind of have an impact on it. So we can't necessarily make any generalizable conclusions, but it does lead to some interesting questions. Again, what point is the saturation point for the number of ethics courses or embedded modules that we should include in a class? So section 5.3, which is titled Positive Impact of EE Modules is Robust Across Many Contexts, basically explored how there are many different classes that could embed ethics and that they tried it across these and that it had a positive impact. So it doesn't need to just be embedded within an Introduction to CS course. So this might raise some questions about, well, do we need to just have a standalone ethics course, or are there ways that we can embed this throughout different types of courses? So this study might suggest that, yes, we can include this across different types of classes. So if you're like a high school educator, maybe you include it in your app development course, maybe you include it in your Introduction to CS course, maybe you include it in your game design course, etc. But this leads into the next section, which is 5.4, which is on the replication of results showing positive impact from CS2 module. So they wanted to basically see, well, can we replicate what happened previously? Which I really applaud the authors for this, because there's not enough research that actually looks back at prior research and says, hey, can we have a replication of these results? Can we duplicate this in some way to make sure that this was not just a one-off success? Yay, we found this positive thing, but then if we were to actually try it again, we'd find out, no, it actually didn't have that same impact. And so they did find that if you embedded the ethics, then it had a significantly higher scores or ratings than if you did not, which makes sense. Now, the next section, which is the discussion section, kind of highlights or rephrases or summarizes some of the prior findings that I just kind of mentioned. But here's an interesting quote that I'm going to read from page 657. Quote, reflecting on the results of these 2 investigations as it relates to EE program design, we surmise that one EE module is sufficient to achieve a certain level of attitude and self-efficacy, but it appears that an additional module is unlikely to further increase scores. Furthermore, since attitude and self-efficacy scores were observed to diminish with time, but can be restored by a subsequent module experience, The results suggest that an effective delivery of EE modules is to provide an initial EE module, followed by time-delayed subsequent module experiences. This should help to sustain student attitudes and self-efficacy levels across time, end quote. If you want to read more of the study, I do include a link to it in the show notes, so I highly recommend taking a look at it. But this is the point in the podcast where I kind of like to talk about some lingering questions and thoughts when I read through these papers. So the first question or thought that I have is there a point where you don't think computer scientists need to focus on ethics in computing? So as I mentioned previously, is there a saturation point for understanding ethics? And is that saturation point the same frequency with which someone should engage in ethical computing? The two can be very different. One is an understanding and one is actually applying that understanding within a context that is real world. Let's make this even more concrete. So rather than just focusing on ethics, let's think about this in relation to accessibility or equity. At what point is there a saturation point where students understand how to write accessible and equitable programs, but should that understanding stop in terms of the application of that understanding? I would argue no, but maybe you disagree with me on that, and that's okay. I'm curious what your perspective would be. So if we take that same rationale, that same understanding of, yes, we've reached an understanding of what ethics is and how to use it within computing, but should we stop utilizing that in the programs that we create or the products that we design, especially when we think about the assumptions kind of like embedded within studies like these. So yes, there is an increase in terms of like the baseline or like the control group that did not receive any kind of treatment, did not do any kind of ethical training, or etc. So while the group that did receive that treatment had an increase in self-efficacy and attitudes, at what point is that enough of an increase? So like let's take it away from like a discussion on ethics. So if like on a scale from 0 to 100, somebody is like 90% racist, and we engaged in some kind of a module that helped them to be only 80% racist, is that enough? If we found that a second module only got them to 78% racist, should we stop at the first module? Because, well, there wasn't enough of a decrease in the amount of racism of the students who participated. And again, this is not a critique of the authors or anything. I enjoyed reading through this paper, and I think it's very important questions to explore. I'm just posing some questions to the field that we can't just look at the increases or decreases and go, well, we've reached the saturation point with this, like it's going to have some diminishing returns. What we really need to think about is, okay, but what is the impact that we want to actually have on the students that we work with and the field and, the people who use the products and things that are designed by computer scientists. So if you think that ethics, or again, if we think broadly, like accessibility, equity, etc., should be embedded, at what point should it be embedded within a unit or a class, etc.? So for example, one of the things that I talked about in prior episodes is in like the elementary space in particular, there's often a discussion on using physical computing. So a question can be asked, at what point should you use physical computing? Should you use it to introduce a CS concept? Should you use it to reinforce a CS concept? So like if we have like a beginning, middle, and end of lessons, should it be like a middle lesson of a group of 3? Or should it come at the end to like reinforce the computational thinking or the concept that's being taught? Like there's no right or wrong way to do it. I tended to do it towards the middle so that way you'd have an introduction. You have this need to know. You dive deeper into it by looking at it from a different angle through like physical computing. And then you move on to applying that like newer or deeper understanding into the project you previously started. Same thing can be explored with the ethics discussions. So at what point in a course do you actually apply ethics and explore it? So if you're learning like a new concept, or you're creating some kind of like a new app or a new design, do you do this before you learn the concept? Do you think about ethics? Would that cause overwhelm in that you're trying to learn a new thing while also learning how to apply it in an ethical way? Is that going to be too many things from a cognitive load standpoint? Or do you put it towards the middle of a semester or a unit, or etc.? Or do you do it at the end? Or is this like a standalone thing in between different units and different projects, etc.? So I don't have necessarily an answer where I think that you as an individual should do it, but I do think it's something important that we should think through as a field and as individuals within the field, especially if you're only going to do it one time for a semester or for a course. It's important to think of when you do that, because you don't want to overwhelm people, but you also don't want to make it this like tangential add-on after you've learned the real stuff. Oh, here we go. We're going to sprinkle in some ethics. Do a little Salt Bay with the ethics. don't want to do that. But another question that I have is, how might a person's understanding of ethics in computing impact their careers in computing? So one of the things that I mentioned previously is that there are many different ways of thinking of education from a design standpoint and from like a student standpoint. Some people go into CS through a bootcamp approach where they spend, I don't know, like 6 weeks or something, just doing a deep dive into one language, one very specific thing to get a very specific type of job at the end of that. Other people go through 4+ year degrees in order to learn computer science more broadly speaking, and then they are going to be able to apply to many different types of jobs to do many different things. Should the bootcamp focus on ethics, or should only the broader degrees focus on ethics? Now, how does that have an impact on the different careers in computing? So if we make a decision that, okay, people who take the CS courses are going to do some ethics, but the people who do the boot camps are just going to focus on like the skills and concepts needed to be able to program and not necessarily the broader implications or impacts of computing. Will that impact then who actually gets to focus on the design side of things? So are there going to be a lower tier of, like, let's say, programmer who is going to just focus on executing the design decisions of somebody who is a higher tier programmer who is actually thinking through the ethical implications, but not necessarily spending the majority of their time doing programming, that is instead divvied out to people who are have a lower paycheck than the people who are actually focusing on the design? Does that then create kind of like a glass ceiling between those who are making those broader decisions and focusing on equity and those who are not? And will it get to a point where like companies are going to hire consultants who specialize in ethics as opposed to hiring generalists who have kind of dabbled in ethics and computing? If you just kind of think of it as like, again, sprinkling it into like your program as opposed to from the ground up, it is a core part of what it is that you are creating, that's going to require different kinds of expertise or different kinds of thinking that's going to occur within that company or within that product development. Again, I don't have a right or wrong answer for this, but I think it's something that we should all kind of think through as a field, which is why I've been doing this little mini series on ethics in computing. And you can check out the other episodes on that in the show notes at jaredoleary.com. And you can just click the link in the app that you're listening on and it'll take you straight to that. Thank you so much for listening to this episode. I hope it raised some questions for you to consider with the CS classes that you work with. And if you'd like to talk about your thoughts on when and how to embed ethics within a K-12 or even higher education class, happy to have you join for an interview. There's a contact me button on my website at jaredoleary.com. Stay tuned next week for another episode. Till then, I hope you're all staying safe and are having a wonderful week.